Randy, thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure and an honor and a privilege to be here. And I particularly want to thank Rick Lewis and Cheryl and all the OSBA staff for all the things they do to remain vital to the members. So let's give them a hand. I've known Rick for a long time, and through great stories that I steal from him, and I like to think I give a few back, but also just the value of association, how important that is, and he has done such a good job of that. I also realize that I'm standing here because of people who are board members in various places. It was my pleasure to serve as a school superintendent in Muskingum County for 15 years. 5 of those were at the county office where we created what became Muskingum Valley, and Bryce and Larry are here who were part of that initial board that went from 15 to 7 members. Where I grew up, Sarah's the school board member there. This is my 50th class reunion this summer. It's hard to believe given my youthful parents, but the truth of it is I got a great education in that small high school that prepared me for the world that I was entering. So to all those board members and all the selfless things you do, I want to say thank you, because at the end of the day, it is difficult being a school board member. I don't want to be like, well, let me give you an example. I like political humor. Now, there's a lot to laugh at these days, so I'm not going to go there. But I'll back up. President William Howard Taft was a big man. He was 6'8", 380 pounds. And one of his nemesis was a senator from New York, Chauncey Depew. They really didn't like each other. And every chance they got to dig at each other, they did. So they were both on a platform like this in New York, and Senator Depew was first. And he's talking about President Taft. And he said, oh, he's pregnant with courage. He's pregnant with integrity, all taking digs at the real size of President Taft. President Taft then got up and he thanked Senator Depew. And he said, well, if I am pregnant, if it's a boy, we're going to name it Courage. If it's a girl, we're going to name it Integrity. But if it's what I suspect it is, merely gas, we're going to name it Chauncey. So what I'm hoping is that isn't just gas that we give here this morning, that there's some substance along with it. But another one that I want to share, that I went to the FDR Museum and Library this last summer in New York, and I'd never been there. And I found in the archives a very poignant story. And it was one about when FDR passed away in Warm Springs, Georgia. He took the long train ride back with his body to Washington, D.C. Now, the country was shocked because no one has ever served president longer. And during the times that he served as president, Depression, World War II, and it had made several stops along the way. And there was one newspaper reporter who was in this small town watching as the train stopped. He saw a man sobbing uncontrollably as the train was there and people were all silent around it. So he walked up to the man and he said, did you know the president? And he looked at him and he said, no, but the president knew me. I say that because that's what all of you are. You know your communities. You know your communities better than anybody in Columbus, Ohio. You certainly know your communities far better than people in Washington, D.C. And one of the things I'm going to do is to encourage you, is to take, because they know you. They elected you. You represent them, and they are your first and most important groups to really represent at the local level. So I want to encourage you to do some of those things. The other thing I'm always reminded of in settings like this, because while I've always taken my work seriously, I don't always take myself seriously. And I'm always reminded when I first began as superintendent in 1986, a couple of years later, we brought all the kindergartners to, this was at John Glenn High School, which was our high school in New Concord, and we brought all the kids from surrounding school districts, or schools rather, to John Glenn High School because they were going to be the class of 2000, the first class of the 21st century. So you can imagine we have 225 kindergartners we're bringing from the surrounding schools. We're all bringing them to John Glenn High School. The kindergarten teachers had worked with the kids on their aspirations for the 21st century. So we had a balloon launch. We videotaped all this. We planted a tree in front of John Glenn High School. There's still a tree there. It's not the one we planted because it died a couple years later. It's not the one that I replaced it with. It died later. And I learned, every time you get a bigger tree, it just costs more. But there is a tree there. But as we walked into the gymnasium, on one side are all the bleachers and all the high school kids are there. And on the gym floor, about 225 kids are starting to assemble in risers. Now, this is just my second year as superintendent, the true story. So as the kids are assembling, the kindergarten teachers, the traveling music teachers who had been working with the kids on various numbers, they're getting ready to go. And I walk up and I'm facing the kids. And I said, anybody know who I am? Little boy raised his hand and said, you're Mr. Mahoney. Now, I was impressed. This kindergartner knew who I was. I said, anybody know what my job is? Little girl raised her hand and said, you're the superintendent. Now we're about ready to go, and I asked one last question, and this is the question I asked. I said, does anybody know what the superintendent does? Very quickly, hand went up a little boy. I said, what? He said, nothing. The kindergarten teacher who was right there looked at me and said, this may be the brightest group we've ever had. Now, I can tell you, 13 years later, I went to their senior assembly. I told that story. The kindergarten teacher was still there and the music teachers, and they stood by what they said. But it is a reminder that if you cannot laugh at yourself, you leave the job to everybody else. But there's something about in communities watching kids to grow and become. And you are part of that legacy. And you contribute to the conditions in which people have to work. And that's what I want to urge you to think about. Now, I want to start with a quiz and a quote and a passage. Now, the quiz is this. It's 1936, 3 years before the first NCAA Men's Division I basketball tournament. Larry, even you weren't playing then. In 1936, however, in New York City at Madison Square Garden, there were 4 undefeated teams squaring off. But the big game was between Long Island University, who had gone completely undefeated the year before, and now was undefeated here at this Christmas tournament. They were playing a little school from the West Coast, Stanford. The New York Times had an article about this game in which the Long Island University coach, who was legendary at the time, talked about one of the players on Stanford's team. He said, I'll tell you what, if I had a kid who did that stuff, that kid couldn't play for me. Now, I want you to think, what was it that kid did? This sophomore guard for Stanford that the coach of Long Island said, you wouldn't play for me if you did that. Now, there's the quiz question. Now, let me go on with what happened. Game gets teed up. As it turns out, that sophomore guard was pretty good. He scored 16 points. Stanford upset previously undefeated Long Island by 15 points. Coach stood by his remark, and not only did that kid continue to do what the other coach would bench him for, he did it very well. Now, as you think, what did this kid do? If you know what the kid did, raise your hand. I'm just sort of curious. Okay? All right, a couple of you do. Here's what he did. When I tell you, it's just so disarming. He shot a one-handed jump shot. Think about that, because up until then, this is how we would shoot. And this kid shot a one-handed jump shot, apparently very well, too. And that was innovation. Now, you tell people, they go, what? Innovation sometimes can be so dramatic, so simple, but somebody had to be willing to say, we're going to do one-hand jump shots here. That's how we're going to be successful. And everybody else, the best coach in basketball is telling you, nobody should do that. If you did that on my team, you couldn't play. So I want you to think about the power of innovation. Now, here's the second quiz. This one goes in probably about 2007, 2008. There was an inventor, Dean Kamen. He had several inventions to his credit. They were medical device inventions. Very good at this. But he had a new one, and he knew this one was going to change the world. Two of his friends were Jeff Bezos and Steve Jobs. They both wanted to put large sums of money into it if he would give him just a small piece of the company. In fact, Bezos said, look, I'll give you $60 million if I can just have 15%. He declined all those. He said, nope, we're going to raise the money from private capital, venture capitalists, and he kept it very tight what he was doing. Now, he hoped that once sales began, they planned to sell 10,000 of these a week to the American public. Not only that, that it would grow. Now, what happened is over 5 years, they sold a total of 30,000. And in 2010, Time Magazine named this invention the technology flop of the decade. What was the invention? The Segway. Remember the Segway? Segway still has lots of uses. But I want you to think about it. Business schools, I'm sure, will use that as a case study for a long, long time. But there are a couple of essential items that I think relate to school board members. The first is he got no feedback from real people. Feedback is the breakfast of champions. Part of you asking your parents who have kids in schools, are they getting what their kids need for their future? Feedback really matters. And Dean Kamen got no feedback. He kept it so tightly held that, and the second part was this. Dean Kamen knew nothing about personal transportation devices. That wasn't his area. He needed to reach out to people because there was a business model for people who understood the transportation personal space. He didn't reach out to them. So my second one is feedback. So innovation matters, and you can do that on the local level, and feedback matters. Now the quote is this. Some of you may remember a guy named Roy McKinley. Roy McKinley was longtime superintendent of Coshocton and then served as a school board member and on the state school board. And Roy McKinley was famous for little quips, and he told me one that I've never forgotten was this. It's better to be one step ahead and leading than 2 steps ahead and being chased. The argument here is leading, and you get to lead in your communities. And the question is, where and how are you going to lead? Now, the passage is this. If you'll indulge me, it's just a short passage written by someone around a memory. As a small child, I lived with my paternal grandmother in an area of our small town known as Boxtown. Others referred to the area as the Hill, because from the top you could easily see most of the town below and always the county courthouse. The Hill was inhabited by a few dominant families known in part for poker games, one-time bootlegging, and more than a few young men who loved fist fighting. One Saturday in the summer when I was 9, my dad, who was visiting from the city, where he worked as a machinist, took me to the Western Auto to purchase my first 2-wheel bicycle. It was red, and if I sat, the tiptoes of my feet would barely touch the ground, keeping me balanced, he wrote. I knew how to ride a bike, and my dad decided I needed a larger one that I could grow into and would last longer over time. He let me ride it home from downtown, which was approximately a mile away. All was fine until I got to the bottom of the hill, which consisted of 500 feet of red brick, followed by a left turn of 150 feet of more red brick before you reached our house in the top of the hill. My dad yelled from his car window, "Pedal hard, you can do this!" And so I started up the long red brick hill. As each pedal would on each side of the bicycle reach its top height, I'd push down hard for the other side to come up with just enough force to keep the bike moving forward. I was completely standing up, pumping as hard as I could up the hill that had a 45-degree angle. Each time when I thought the bike was going to stop moving and fall sideways, I'd push through another downward motion to keep the momentum going. My dad slowly followed his 1959 black and white Ford Galaxy, encouraged me to keep pumping and going. Out of breath, fully red-faced, I just kept going until I made the left turn and finished at the top of the hill. I was both elated and tired. when I made the left turn and finished at the top in front of my grandmother's house. I had indeed pumped my bicycle the entire red brick hill. That singular event became a metaphor for every obstacle I had after that. Though I couldn't express it, born in that event was also the notion that to develop confidence, you need to successfully complete something hard. That's still true for kids today. If you want them to have confidence, give them competence. The latter almost always precedes real confidence. Pumping the red brick hill was hard to do, and while I physically did it, my journey was helped more than a little by the encouraging, insisting, and supporting voice of my dad. Keep going. Don't stop now. Come on, boy, you're almost there. And then I was. That encouragement and support from him was always there, including weekly calls at college when I first started, afraid I wasn't ready for the challenging coursework. But it began with the red brick hill. That real sense of accomplishment felt good. The rest of my life then and now continues to be climbing another red brick hill. There were always obstacles, but support shows you how, encouragement says you can, and confidence comes from overcoming the challenge. But it started with the red brick hill. I like that passage that he wrote, and hopefully there's something there you can recall because you can remember all those. And it's a metaphor for those challenges that we all face. Now, I want to share the context because the challenges change based upon the context. I'm going to show a very short clip here, but I'm going to give you an example, and I have to pick again on Muskingum Valley because this happened. And they've heard me say this, but it was true. But it's a great reminder of context. If you get off the 7th Street exit in Zanesville, Ohio, there's a large building. That's where Muskingum Valley is. And Children's Services is located there, and the health department's located there. And there's a large parking lot. But sometimes, if you get there late, they're having to train. You can't find a place to park. Now, I got to tell you what, when I can't find a place to park, I still do what I'm about to tell you I did then. I invent a spot. Now, I'll tell you my favorite invented spots are the ones where at least half your car is on the line. It's the last line, and you could declare, well, this is a parking spot. I've got a line here. Well, this particular morning, I knew there were people waiting on me, and I couldn't find a spot. So finally, I found a spot that was an invented spot next to an invented spot next to a parking spot. I thought, this is perfect back here. A fire truck can get through here. We're okay. Park my black car. I go in. I don't think about my car all day. It's one of those beautiful October days. Finally, at the end of the day, after the building's pretty much deserted, I get on the elevator and come down. And as I'm coming out, there's a young guy who's walking out of the health department. We walk out the large sliding glass doors, and we start down the sidewalk. Now I see my black car, which is out from the 2 nearest parking spots in a deserted parking lot. I see this young man looking at my car. I said, why do you suppose somebody would park like that? He looked at me and said, I don't know, drunk or stupid. Now, at that point, I wasn't going to tell him that was my car. I stood at the end of the sidewalk and pretended to be waiting for somebody. But at 10 o'clock in the morning, it was resourceful. It was creative. And by 6 o'clock in the evening, it looked like something else. Our world is changing. And I want to show a short clip. And then I'll explain a little more about it, but I want you to see this short clip about the future. I don't know that I want Fido there at the end jumping up on my bed, but I only do this to see where will all these things come to fruition? I don't know, but I want to back up because it's been a decade now, slightly more, since Thomas Friedman wrote his book called The World is Flat. And then in a second book, he said, you realize that when I wrote The World is Flat, and we thought, collaborate and connect in the shrinking world, the iPhone hadn't been invented yet. Twitter was a sound. The cloud was a meteorological condition. An app would have been something that kids would have filled out for college. We begin to see these changes. I often talk about Uber is arguably the most valuable transportation company in the world, and they don't own a vehicle. Airbnb is arguably the most valuable lodging company in the world, and they don't own a hotel. Quicken Loans, third largest mortgage lender in the world, and they don't own a bank. Largest retailer in the world is Amazon, and until recently, they didn't own a store. And on that, you saw one now in which nobody's working there, and it's all done electronically. Or Facebook, despite what's happened, is still the largest social media company in the world, and they own no content. So the truth of it is, our kids are growing up in a world that is dramatically different. But I have to tell you what, rather than just describe this and make bets, you'll have to make your own bets, but there are things that we can do about it. There's a German by the name of Volker Hirsch, and you can go to his TED Talk, and he has a variety of experiences, but he also talks about a number of things that are related to this. Foxconn makes a third of the consumer electronics in the world, and Foxconn is now replacing 60,000 workers in China because paying them $5 an hour apparently seems to be too much. We now have drones in New Zealand that are delivering pizza. We have the vehicle kind on the ground in D.C. right now that are delivering food items. So I could go through a whole host of these, but the bottom line, even Clifford Chance, I talked to an attorney this week from a large firm in Columbus, and I asked him about Clifford Chance. You know Clifford Chance, it's a large reputable law firm in London that they are now doing discovery with artificial intelligence and robots because automation will seek every job that it can. That will happen. And if we think about in this country, we went from 90% of the people employed in agriculture to 2%, and it wasn't the immigrants who took all these jobs. Anything repetitive is in danger of automation. But this isn't to threaten to describe anybody. You know, Harry Truman once said, I don't give people hell, I just tell them the truth and it sounds like hell. Well, the bottom line, there's going to be lots of changes. And it'll create lots of new jobs. I suspect that when Edison invented the light bulb, maybe the next day in somebody's newspaper it said, oh my God, candle industry ruined. We now sell more candles today than we could ever have imagined. But there are going to be changes. I read about a new job, an augmentation memory specialist, how they work with robots. It was fascinating. Now, we could spend all morning talking about these. And I've described it enough because you don't have to drink a gallon of milk to know it's spoiled. Okay? So this is the world that we live in. Now I want to share with you 3 things that I want you to think about. How do you move from obstacles to opportunities? How do you take concerns to collaboration? And how do you stand hopeful, not helpless? Now, the obstacles to opportunities, when you think about climbing up that red brick hill, there were uneven red bricks. It was a slant. It was a new bike. Whether or not this kid had enough strength to get up there, but it also was an opportunity to build strength, to test perseverance, to establish confidence. Now, I brought a couple of props with me. I remember these. Now, I don't know if making board agendas are the same because it's been a long time since I made a board agenda, but I think they're probably the same. And this is... I learned there are 3 things about board agendas. 1, there's a certain set of things only boards can do. As superintendent, I don't get to hire anybody. I can recommend employment, but you hire. I don't get to go out and purchase land without, but there's a group of things only boards can do. Okay, I knew that when I first started. Now there's also some things that boards can't do. Well, at least most of them. There are certain things you can't talk about in executive sessions. There are certain things that you can't do without the public knowing, etc. Now, what's the third thing? The third thing, the majority. There's a ton of things that you can take resolutions on and act on and say, this is our line in the sand. This is what's important to us. That is the majority that I want to talk about. Now, this is a monkey trap. It's a real one. The only difference is my rope isn't as long. But a monkey trap is, they would use these in West Africa. They'd tie this rope around a tree. Now, yeah, it's a coconut and it's hollowed out right here. They'd put nuts and berries in this thing. Now, a monkey would come in and put its hand in there and grasp the nuts and berries and make a fist. Now, when it did, it couldn't get its hand out. And when its captor came to get it, all it had to do was let go of the nuts and berries, pull your hand out, and run. How many monkeys do that? None. Virtually, that's why this works. Therapists sometimes say, we have things that we hold on to. We just need to let go of. You know, it might be that son-in-law, daughter-in-law, brother. We all have those. We just need to let go of it. Let it go. Now, I'm going to suggest there are 3 things in your role as a school board you need to let go. And you may not need to let go of these because you never held on to them to begin with. The first is that testing results are the best, or worse yet, sole measure of student success. If we think that, we need to let go of it. The second thing that I'm going to argue that we need to let go of is that we are adequately preparing our kids for the future. The biggest room in any organization is the room for improvement. And as we look at this future, it's more dynamic than we can ever imagine. And we have to figure out, are we really preparing our kids, and let go of the notion, oh yeah, we're doing fine. We're right on target. Because there are lots of things we could do. And the third thing is, and this is the one that maybe still bothers me the most, is the notion, if you have this, to let go of the notion that test results are ever predictive of adult success. We have kids who believe that. When Rick told the story about the chicken and the eagle, he is right. That at the end of the day, we have people who believe that this is predicting adult success. I used to tell kids, your I do is much more important than your IQ. And I stand by that 100%. If a kid gives me effort, they will get the world. That still matters. So those are some things I think we need to let go of. We started an arms race in this country in February 6, 1992. The New York Times had an article. ETS had created a new testing regimen, and it showed the United States 9-year-olds, 13-year-olds were scoring behind Taiwan, Korea, science, and math. And it set off the standards movement, I'm going to argue, around the test score race. We are not in a race to be the best test takers in the world. We never have been, and we never will be. In fact, after all this standards movement, our test scores are flat. So at the end of the day, this race took off, and that's not to say that standards aren't important, but I'm going to give you some examples. A long time ago, I was an Army officer. I don't believe that when I started, I took a physical test or a marksman test by taking a multiple choice test. I was a baseball coach. I didn't pick my team by giving out essays to the kids at the first practice and see who could write best about essays. At the end of the day, it is about performance. What can you do? Now, that's not to suggest that kids don't need basic skills and we should throw testing out, but we ought to use it what it was intended for. Feedback, information to see. We know kids need to know how to read. We know they need to do some things, but they need to be able to do some things. Ted Dintersmith, and I want to refer this book to you. Ted Dintersmith is a business guy, venture capitalist. He's gotten into education late. He wrote a book and helped film a documentary called Most Likely to Succeed. Spent an entire year visiting schools in every state. He met with about half the state chiefs. You can ask Paulo if he met with him, because that one I don't know. But he was in Ohio, he was in Columbus, and Cleveland, Cincinnati, because I looked at his map of all the places that he visited. And he wrote about them in a book called, in that film that you saw, What Schools Could Be. And I'd encourage you to read it because he puts lots of practical examples that individual school districts are doing all over the country. And it's very, very powerful to look at some of these because in the end, the real change are the changes that are taking place locally. But he gives lots of examples, but I just want to share a couple that struck me. One is Lawrenceville Academy in northeastern United States is a private elite high school. And they conducted an experiment there for 2 years. At the end of the year, kids took final exams. They went home for the summer. Now, for the kids who weren't graduating, who came back, what they did next was to give the kids the same exam, only they took out things that weren't germane to the subject they were teaching. No, just the essential parts of those. And they gave the kids the exact same test and graded them the exact same way. And they did it for 2 years. And what happened is the score went from B plus to F. So the kids who are memory experts, kids who are absolutely achievers in our system, they're not remembering it either. And if I were to ask you a skill, what skill have you mastered? I guarantee you could do it right now for me. Because when we master something, we can do something. And we have begun to lose this and think that it can be replaced by what we're replacing it with. Now, how do you take concerns to collaboration? Think about the Red Brick Hill. The collaboration was between a father and a son. It was very much a performance task. I think about this one. 15 years ago, I was getting ready to go to China. In fact, just about exactly this time, 15 years ago, I had to cancel my trip. The SARS virus, you remember that? The SARS virus, there was a threat. Toronto, Hong Kong, there was a real threat. And what happened? We went from February 2003 to July. And due to a collaboration of a dozen countries across the globe, scientists facilitating experiments with each other, the World Health Organization, not in charge of it, facilitating the learning. We isolated the virus, we found the treatment, and we prevented a pandemic. That's what real collaboration is. And I'm going to argue one of the things that we ought to do is collaborate with other districts, ESCs, businesses, not to consolidate governance, never, but to consolidate efforts around what can we do to help our kids have tasks that can really help them to grow and to become. Now, my teachers didn't say this, but here's what happened in lots of high schools. I can tell you 50 years ago. Now, you may not agree with this, but this is my summary of it. The little high school, we taught the best and hoped for the rest. You were either going to college or you weren't. If you weren't, there were good jobs you could go do and all that. And then in the 70s, we built vocational schools. Then we taught the best and transported the rest. And now we've reached this stage where we need to treat the rest as if they were the best, because they are. I have never in my life met a kid that wasn't smart. The question is, how are you smart? And to figure out what kids' strengths are and to begin to help them become the best version of themselves. And I have to tell you, we have said college and career ready, but it has really been code for college ready. And we have bragged about it. We have done some, in my opinion, some things that make no sense because we have been so bent on test scores and kids going to college. Let me give you a couple of examples. 2 years ago in the White House, they put out a report. Secretary of Education was absolutely disturbed because only half of our high schools were offering calculus. And I thought, really? That's what you're disturbed about? There's a lot of things I could be disturbed about. That wouldn't be one of them, to be candid. It just wouldn't be. Do I think every kid needs calculus? No, I don't even think they all need algebra. Imagine that. When's the last time you had to solve a quadratic equation? Now, I'm not suggesting that there aren't certain jobs, but this idea that this ought to be our gatekeeper. No, it should not be our gatekeeper. It should never be our gatekeeper. We need to give kids real tasks to do. I love Florida. Florida's a great example. They have a teacher bonus program. I'm all for it if you can come down with certain kinds of things that make sense. But one of theirs is this. To qualify to receive the bonus in Florida, the teacher has to go back and produce their ACT score, and it needs to have been in the top 20%. Now, I got to tell you what. I can't think of anything more stupid, to be really honest. This idea that, first of all, I couldn't find mine. Second of all, I did, I'm sure I'd be disappointed. I'd say, Rick, I'm a chicken. I've been acting like an eagle. I'm so sorry. But this idea, this is the kind of nonsense that needs cut off at the local level. You say, we're not doing this. We're not doing this. I mean, those things matter. Ted Dintersmith writes about this. And I have to tell you what, there are colleges that buy right into this. Colleges love to brag about how many kids didn't get in their school. Now think about it. Can you imagine if you bragged about how many kids didn't get in your school? Or they'll say how high their scores were. The question is not who are you getting. The question ought to be, what'd you do with who you got? And if you're doing such a good job, how come we have 43 million Americans that have $30,000 in debt from school loans? 2.5 million of those are over 60 years old. 25% are defaulting on loans, and we make school loans the easiest in the world to get and the most difficult to ever get rid of. So at the end of the day, if we're going to make an investment for a kid, it needs to be an investment in their future, not a system's future that helps to support the system, because you want to help your kids. So at the end of the day, we're thinking about how we take concerns to collaboration. We don't want to climb the ladder of success and realize too late, hey, it was against the wrong wall. And the wall ought to be doing, learning. Now, I want to give you some real examples. Because the other part I want to make sure that everybody knows, because you know this, because we see it. We are a part of the most robust economy in the world. Nobody has won more Nobel Prizes, had more patents for inventions, and created the greatest economy on the earth. And it has not been because of test scores, nor will the decline or flattening of them lead us to that. And that's not to dismiss basic skills. So I need to say that. But we are killing our seed corn, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship. Now, I come to the last thing, which becomes, how do you move from helpless to hopeful? Now, my experience growing up in Southeast Ohio has been this. If you want a helping hand, the best place to look is at the end of your own arm. I believe that. That if I wait for Washington, Columbus, somebody else to solve my problem, that's going to be like a woman waiting for the perfect man. It's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen here, okay? Going up the red brick hill was never about not trying. The dad didn't say, oh, son, why don't you just put your bike in the trunk and we'll ride up the hill? Or why don't you get off it and walk up? Don't try. God forbid you might fall over on the bike and skin your knee. I think about Sarah Blakely. Sarah Blakely, you can look this up, and I want to be delicate about how I say this, because what Sarah Blakely, her story is legendary, but I believe she was getting ready to go to an important event. It might have been a date, and she couldn't wear sandals with pantyhose. So I think I have this right. I want to be careful about how I describe this, so she cuts the bottoms out so she can wear sandals. She still liked it because it had a slimming effect, so she came up with a thing she called Spanx. It took 7 years before somebody finally invested. Her stories are fascinating. She would go to places, and you know something's really good when it really takes off, and somebody goes, I've been doing that for years. I could have done that. I could have thought of that. She was the first Forbes named billionaire. But her story's fascinating. She went to a lawyer's office. They said, he thought candid cameras in there because what she was suggesting was so stupid. She explains all these things, but I love the part where she says, I kept coming back to at the dinner table. I had a dad who would look at me and my brothers, and he would say every night, "Hey, what'd you fail at today?" That is how we learn. We learn. That doesn't mean we want somebody to get hurt, but failing is learning. If you're not failing, you're not learning. And kids need to have projects that help them to do those things. Those matter a great deal. So when you think about giving kids real hope takes three things. We need goals. We need agency to help them have the skills to get there. And we need pathways where it leads somewhere. It's been a false choice to say every kid needs college, because you know that's not true. And it's also been a false choice to say, well, then you should be in the trades. There's a whole array of things out there. And part of it is trying to figure out what kids' gifts are and channeling them into things. I was always struck when I went to Finland several years ago, because whether you went to their what's called their vocational university or their regular university, about 50% of the kids went to one or the other. They were held in equal respect. We did not do that in this country. Work is respect. That is what matters. At the end of the day, I don't know about you, but when my daughter finally finished school, that isn't what I celebrated. It was a J-O-B. That matters. And this idea of like this, yes, it does matter. Yes, it does matter. I don't care how many degrees you have. I've worked hard to overcome a PhD. But at the end of the day, it's about really finding your place to where you can be productive and earn and all of those things. Now, how can you move from helpless to hopeful? You set the conditions for great learning in your school district. You set the conditions. Whatever you do is what people pay attention to. Student exhibitions, where kids demonstrate their work, whether it's a senior project, there are great examples. I went to a third grade invention convention, my first, about 6 weeks ago. And I was blown away by these third graders who had been set up. You have to solve a problem. And they created things, and it couldn't be so fanciful that you couldn't do it. And the first one I went to, here's this little girl who's in the third grade. She waited until there were a group of us around, because they started this every 5 minutes. She had her presentation. She's 8 years old. And she goes, my problem is kids losing shoes. It happens to me. I can never find both of my shoes when I need them. So I have created something that holds the shoes together. So when you go, whenever you take them off, they will quickly put together by Velcro. She explained the problem, asked any of us if we had any questions. We didn't. We moved on to the next one. And I thought, this is what real learning is. This was powerful. She had to be able to make a presentation to a group of adults, answer questions. They had worked on, you have 2 minutes to do that part. And as you went to each of these, I thought, how simple yet how profound and how powerful that was. You set the conditions, whether it's mock trials or connecting STEM to the real world. Find things that play out this old proverb when I began teaching 45 years ago, which is as true today as it was then. What I hear, I forget. What I see, I remember. What I do, I understand. We need to give kids things that are about doing, that cause them to create, cause them to do critical thinking. There's some things that machines cannot do, ever. They do not feel empathy. They do not make things with love. They are not creative. Those things machines cannot do. These are things that are uniquely human. So as we begin to think about the things that we want, it matters. I said to Bryce this morning, I said, look, there's a great quote. I don't know who gave it to me, but it was, aging wrinkles the body, quitting wrinkles the soul. Don't quit. Because our goal is to make it better for a next group of kids. We are planting. You are planting shade trees in which you may never enjoy the shade, but you create the learning conditions. And you can say, well, Columbus won't. Yes, they will. Remember, the majority of what you do, you can do. And give Paulo feedback. But at the end of the day, do those things. Because what you have is far greater than accountability. What you have is ownership. Owners are that's a higher level of accountability. Ownership is when I was superintendent, I'd walk in the store and they'd say, how come you guys hired that coach? What were you thinking? How come you're asking for a levy? How come every time I turn around, your hand's in my pocket? And you got to look at your neighbors. That's not what the state board does. They don't have those conversations. And I'm not dismissing them. I'm saying you have ownership of your kids. That's a higher form of accountability. And how is it that you take that ownership and do right by your kids? It matters. You have, and your kids have their red brick hills. But you think about the things that make us human. I'll give you one example. My favorite, it's baseball season. In fact, as I leave here, I'm going to Pittsburgh because I'm going to see the Pirates. Not that I'm a Pirate fan. I like the Pirates, but I love the stadium and I love baseball. Now, I have to tell you, it's been, well, for the real baseball fan, you'll remember this event. If you're a real baseball fan. It was June 1978. I took my 8th grade class to Kings Island all day. I think that was in the course of study back then. I guess I didn't ask the state for permission. Oh, there were courses of study, at least rumors of them. But I took my kids to Kings Island all day, and then we'd go to a Reds game that night. The small school that I taught on the Ohio River, my kids didn't go to Riverfront Stadium regularly. They did. This was a big-time treat. Now, keep in mind, 1978, Pete Rose, Johnny Bench, Perez, the big red machine. And my kids were excited. And we went out into the red seats in center field. You know where I'm talking about, at the old stadium. And we were out there. The name of our school went up on the scoreboard. We were one of 900 groups recognized that night with 10 seconds of fame. But it's okay. We were there. As it turned out, I guarantee you to this day, there is not a kid who I sat with in those red seats who won't remember what happened that night. It was June 1978. The Reds were playing the St. Louis Cardinals, and a future Hall of Fame Reds pitcher pitched the only no-hitter of his career. Now, if you're a Reds fan, you go, Hall of Fame pitcher? That doesn't seem to go together. But Tom Seaver was the pitcher, and we were there, and from the 7th inning on, we're standing. Now, I told you I used to coach baseball. Now, I have my 8th graders there, and from the 7th inning on, each pitch, and finally we get down to the 9th inning, there's 2 outs. Seaver delivers, pop up, shortstop, Concepcion moves under, gets it, the place erupts. It was a big deal. We got to see a no-hitter, the only one of his career, one of the few pitchers for Cincinnati who ever pitched a no-hitter. Now, a quiz question comes up on the big center scoreboard, which was easy for us to see. We just had to turn around. It was right there. The big question was, do you know the last pitcher to pitch a no-hitter for the Cincinnati Reds? Now, keep in mind, this was in 1978. And the clues go up. It was August, some date, 1961. Then a couple of other hints. It was against this team and the score. And then came up the answer in large letters. There may be somebody in here, Dan's from that area. You may know that. You may know who that is. Do you know who it is, Dan? Here it was, in giant letters. You got the picture right. Jim Maloney. Now, I got to tell you what, if you look at that, it would be very easy to confuse an L for an H. The kid next to me did. He looked at me and I said, well, of course that's me. I used to pitch. Up and down the rows, and for at least 5 minutes, the kids all believed that. And I'd see the kids years later at the high school. I'd say, well, looks like the Reds want me to come back to spring training again this year. And we could laugh about it. Building relationships with kids through things that they learn and do matter. They still matter. And those who would delude us into thinking that everything... I saw a bumper sticker the other day. It said, why are we in this handbasket and where are we going? But this notion that unless we continue to improve our scores, that innovation will disappear, creativity will disappear. I think they're absolutely wrong. Now, I have one last thing here I brought with me because I told you I like baseball. I went last summer to the Baseball Hall of Fame. And while I was there, they have all these sports memorabilia, and I bought my first piece of sports memorabilia ever. Because I saw it, and it brought back a childhood memory, and I thought, I got to get this. Now, those of you who remember a catcher's glove that was like this, where you had to actually catch it. Now, this particular one is signed by, in my opinion, the greatest catcher ever. And not the one that I saw in 1978, because this was before Johnny Bench, because he's certainly a great one. This was somebody who played in the 50s and 60s, and who I grew up as a kid. I remembered. His signature's on here. Yogi Berra. Now, the guy authenticated the signature. He said it may not have been Yogi's glove, but it was clearly the style they used at the time, and he may have had a bunch of these he signed, but he said it is his signature. Well, I bought that because I thought I just want this. Now, here's my lesson note to all of you about this. As I went around, I started thinking about baseballs because they sell lots of things there, and I thought about signatures. And I thought about how at one time I tried to get various signatures, okay? I tried to get certain kinds of signatures, and I collected some of these. Some of them I had to pay a great deal for. And then I realized this summer, I thought, what a mistake. What a mistake for me to be getting the signatures of famous players. That here's whose signatures I ought to be getting. There's an old saying in Southeast Ohio, if you've ever heard this. Did you ever see a turtle on a fence post? If you did, it didn't get there by itself. And none of us get to where we are by ourselves. We have the wind beneath our wings too. The people who encouraged us to try something. Like Sarah Blakely's dad said, what'd you fail at today? Somebody who said you can do this. And trying something hard and getting better. That's how you master things. Anyway, I have some baseballs, and what I want to suggest to each of you is you ought to get your baseball, and you ought to have the people sign this who helped you get to where you are today, because those are the real people in your life that absolutely matter, and it is what makes us human. It is those things that matter most. I guarantee you that 50 years from now, when your students who you'll meet this spring are getting ready for graduation, and they're assembling in a room like this, they're not going to say, oh, gee, I think that was the year Ohio had the new accountability system, wasn't it? I think that's the time they changed from AIR to TFA to W3. Was it? That's not what they're going to talk about. You know that's not what they're going to talk about. What are they going to talk about? They're going to talk about you. And they're going to talk about the relationships to help them to grow and become. Because we are going to help kids in a world that is so uncertain, so changing. They need our best efforts. And the things you do to create the conditions for which kids are going to learn and grow and become matter. But I hope that we never, ever dispense with creativity and innovation, the things Ted Dintersmith talks about that helped us to get to where we are today. That we have made an imbalance, and we don't want to lose the very things that have made us. The other part I've come to realize is early on, when I was a teacher, they'd talk about local control, and I didn't really understand it. Now I am back to where I was. Communities are the most important fabric of this state and of this nation, and you are at the heart of that community. And the things you do for and by your kids matter more than anything else. Certainly more than what legislators and a whole host of other people do. You get to establish the conditions. You get to decide whether or not you're going to encourage teachers to experiment and to try and to have kids do things, as opposed to solely judging them based upon, can I see the third grade scores, the fourth? You understand what I'm saying here. And the last thing is to remember, most of all, it is to absolutely be human. You look like you played baseball. Did you play baseball? All right, here we go. We're going to start. There's one. Okay. Bryce, I know you did. And you're going to have Larry sign one of yours. Okay? But it's a reminder, metaphorically, to everybody in here, have people sign your baseballs that made a difference in your life. Who would be in your Hall of Fame? Those are the ones that are most important. All right, those matter. Where's Rick? Rick's a big baseball player. I want you to get, Rick can even catch a grounder. Hey, Cheryl, here you go. Pick up this grounder, that's for Rick. You can tell him what it's for. Tell him to have the Eagles sign that. Last thing, thank you for all you do on behalf of kids. Because people don't know who you are unless it really gets ugly. Let's be honest. But you quietly do those things that matter. You are planting those trees. So like the kid going up the red brick hill, your job continues to be in your community to take obstacles and make them opportunities for kids, to turn concerns into real collaboration with others, and to make hopeless hopeful. And you can do that. So I'll say in behalf of, we have 200 school board members, we probably have hundreds of school districts also represented one way or another, who also represent thousands of kids. So on behalf of the thousands of kids whom your work really does matter and they don't know it, I'll stop with saying on their behalf to all of you, thank you for what you do. It matters.
Thank you.